The VZA returned an answer to General Bonaparte, and there were several interchanges of couriers between them. But the secret of that negotiation had never transpired. It was known to be still carrying on, and this circumstance raised a hope in the public mind, which was fondly cherished by everyone. General Bonaparte held the result in his hands and husbanded the means of turning it to the account of his ulterior views. The footing upon which he had placed that negotiation formed part of the instructions which he gave to General Kleber on leaving him. The further management of it, as well as all the documents connected with it, Kleber was soon disposed to consider this negotiation as a means of quitting a country against which everyone was railing, more especially as the departure of General Bonaparte had removed the only restraint that had kept the freedom of language within bounds. The new general-in-chief soon showed how little inclined he was to follow up the system of his predecessor. This was manifested by the indecorous conversations held in his house, where a censor was busy with General Bart's military operations and private habits. Not only did he suffer these conversations to go on, but it was easy to perceive that he listened to them with pleasure. There arose very soon between the officers who had served in the armies of the North and of the Sambre and Meuse, and those who had served in the army of Italy, the same jealousy that had already displayed itself between General Jourdan's officers and those of General Kleber at the army of the Sambre and Meuse. Those who had served in the last named army and whose discontent had broken out on their first arrival at Cairo were the first whom General Kleber took into his intimacy. He soon became the idol of all who wished for the evacuation of Egypt, a wish which they were constantly intimating to him. This feeling pervaded the army to such an extent that Kleber, so surrounded, was debarred of the means of receiving any impressions or advice that might be at variance with his own opinions. All minds were henceforward bent on finding out the impossibility of executing whatever was calculated to give stability to the residents of the army in Egypt, which object was no longer one of constant anxiety as it had been when General Bonaparte held the command. In a short time, all thoughts were exclusively directed to France, and each one made his private arrangements in anticipation of the return home. In a word, Egypt had no longer any hold on the imagination of the army. Kleber was a worthy man, and unquestionably a brave and talented general, but his mild disposition and weakness of character formed a striking contrast with his athletic and commanding figure. It appears that he was brought up to the profession of an architect, which, owing to a relish for the military life, he relinquished and entered one of the Austrian regiments of the Low Countries. He was living in Alsace when the revolution broke out and quitted the service of Austria to embark in it. Although he was diametrically averse to the system of equality, he had just been named adjutant to one of the battalions of volunteers of the Upper Rhine, when that corps was called to Metz, where it remained shut up with the garrison which defended it at the first siege. He distinguished himself on that occasion, proceeded to La Vendée as a general officer subsequently to the capitulation of Metz, and afterwards returned to serve with the army of the Sambre and Meuse, whence the Directory removed him in consequence of his perpetual opposition to General Jourdan, its commander-in-chief. Thus matters stood when General Bonaparte obtained an employment for him in his own army. It was his disposition to be always dissatisfied, and he acknowledged his dislike of subordination, except in the inferior ranks. Though an agreeable man, he had not a comprehensive turn of mind, and the least unfavorable opinion formed of him from his conduct in Egypt was that he had not been struck by the conviction of the infallible results with which, sooner or later, the occupation of that country would be attended. All these disadvantages were increased by a perfect ignorance of the management of political affairs, so as necessarily to place him at the mercy of everyone, and of those in particular who were desirous of returning to France through his instrumentality. There was no difficulty, therefore, in persuading him to follow up the negotiations already opened with the Vizier, and in presenting them to his mind merely as the means of taking back to France an army whose services she stood in need of, in the opinion of men little aware from experience of what our country could achieve through the mere impulse given by a clever and active government. A character of greater importance was given to the communications open with the Grand Vizier by substituting an officer in the army for the Tartars hitherto employed, and it seemed as if an anxiety was felt to hurry on the negotiation by connecting the English with it. The pretense given out for this change was that whatever stipulations might be concluded with the Turks, nothing would have been done unless the English, as masters of the sea, were a contracting party to them. The chief of battalion, Moran, was accordingly sent to Sir Sidney Smith instead of the Vizier. The officer only succeeded in fighting him by going to the Vizier's camp near Nazareth in Syria. Sir Sidney Smith was flattered by the message, which, being addressed to him, presented him to the Turkish army in a higher character than what properly belonged to the captain of a ship and commodore on a cruise, which were the only commissions he held from his government. He did not hesitate, therefore, in accepting the part of mediator, which was offered to him by the Turks and not resisted by Kleber. When he saw the contrast between General Kleber's unsuspecting confidence and General Bonaparte's cautious avoidance of such a feeling, his penetration told him at once the turn he might give to the negotiation. Accordingly, from this very first overture in which the question of the evacuation of Egypt was entertained, General Kleber found himself perhaps more deeply committed than he could have wished, because Sir Sidney Smith gave him a reply of so positive a nature that little more was left to discuss than the basis of the evacuation, the principle itself appearing to have been agreed upon. The chief of battalion, Moran, returned with this answer to General Kleber at Cairo. He seemed to have been at last awakened to the danger of that influence which had controlled his actions, and whether he felt desirous of averting its consequences by means of a counterpoise or of linking the highest authorities in the army to his plans. He had already recalled General Desaix to Cairo from Upper Egypt for the sake of the weight which his name could not fail to stamp upon any means that might be adopted. He was scarcely arrived when news was brought of the appearance of the fresh Turkish fleet at the mouth of that branch of the Nile which discharges itself into the Sea of Damietta. General Kleber at once saw that this fleet was intended to form a combined system of operations with the Vizier's army, and that the latter would now advance towards Egypt. He hastened therefore to dispatch General Desaix to Damietta for the purpose of resisting any attempt of the Turkish fleet. But when he arrived, he found that fortune had already favored us with the most brilliant and complete success. General Verdier was in command at Damietta and had a few battalions encamped on the right bank of the Nile between Lesbos and that town. Assisted by Sir Sidney Smith's 2 ships, the Turks landed a few thousand men on the beach leading to Lesbos. They were covered by 2 pieces of cannon which the English had brought on shore, intending to mount them upon the ruins of an old tower, seemingly part of the ancient town of Damietta, whence they completely commanded the only road by which alone our troops could advance. General Verdier, however, did not allow the boats time to go back and bring a second supply of troops ashore, although his soldiers were at the distance of half a league from the Turkish landing place. It took him no more 2 hours to collect them, bring them down to the bench, and drive the Turks into the sea. At the very moment when the Turkish boats had pushed off from the shore, those who hesitated to plunge into the water were taken prisoners, and out of all the soldiers who had been landed from the ships, no one effected his escape. General Verdier had so conducted his attack as to force the Turks back upon the town, against which the English cannon were pointed, and thereby protected us from their fire. Never was success more complete or more decisive. Nothing was therefore left to General Desaix but to congratulate General Verdier, and he only remained at Damietta the time requisite to enable him to visit La Mensal. The Turkish fleet having set sail in the meantime, he came back to Cairo, where he arrived some days after the return of the chief of battalion, Moran, from Syria. The first proceedings of Sir Sidney Smith had so far advanced the pending negotiation that after the reply brought back by Moran, nothing more was left than to discuss the terms of the evacuation, as if the event had come to pass which could alone justify that measure of extremity. The moment had now arrived when Kleber should have assembled the chiefs of the army. He acted otherwise, however, and determined at once to open negotiations with with the VCA, he again sent a message to that chief, who was attended by Sir Sidney Smith. The reply was still more prompt and decisive than on the former occasion, and Sir Sidney Smith, who was anxious to become the mediator in the negotiation, failed his offer of services under a cloak of liberality, which the occasion served him as an excuse for assuming. He urged as a pretext for his offer the possibility of bad faith or treachery on the part of the Turks, evils which he perhaps in reality apprehended. He also proposed his own ship as the seat of a negotiation which he was more anxious to have at once entered upon, and apprised General Kleber of his intention to proceed forthwith to Damietta, where he would await his answer. Kleber immediately replied that he accepted the offer and dispatched General Desaix and Monsieur Puiseux, the intendant of the military finances, to Damietta with full powers. I accompanied General Desaix and was the person whom he sent with Monsieur Perusa on board the Tiger, which lay in the Bay of Damietta, to agree upon the day and hour which General Desaix and Monsieur Puiseux were to embark. Having gone off to the ship at a late hour of the day, I was unable to return until the following morning, and had therefore to pass the night on board Sir Sidney Smith's ship, where every mark of attention was shown to me. I was at that time scarcely 24 years of age, but was of a reflecting turn of mind, and saw that Sir Sidney Smith had many advantages over us and would be the winner in the game he was about to play. It was beyond my power of comprehension to understand how we could submit to lend ourselves to our own ruin, for we had commenced by acting a secondary part, and were clearing away the difficulties instead of raising fresh ones. There must undoubtedly have existed a conviction that General Bonaparte would never reach France, or that the Directory would act with severity towards him. It would otherwise be impossible to account for the conduct pursued since his departure from Egypt. I returned to General Desaix, and I informed him of what I had seen, and what had been agreed upon between Sir Sidney Smith and myself. The embarkation took place the next day at Damietta, where the English boats came to take up General Desaix and Monsieur Puiseux, together with the secretary, the latter, who had accompanied me on board Sir Sidney Smith's ship. I again attended General Desaix on this occasion, and we soon got on board the Tiger. While Sir Sidney Smith was pressing General Kleber to enter into negotiation, he was urging the Turkish army to commence operations, and it had accordingly broken up from the camp of Nazareth and taken the road through Gaza for the purpose of cutting off the small fort of El Arish, which stands in the midst of the desert that separates Africa from Asia and is the key to Egypt in that quarter. General Kleber had just received this intelligence, and, apprehensive of some misfortune for El Arish and for himself, he sent one of his aides de camp to General Desaix, who brought these details to him on board the Tiger, with an order to demand as a preliminary condition a suspension of hostilities, a condition which had not before occurred to the commander-in-chief, although his object was to save his army when he proposed the evacuation of Egypt. The suspension of arms was demanded, but Sir Sidney Smith replied that he could only interpose his good offices with the VCA, to whom he would immediately address a letter on this subject. He did so, and it was hot but for a few days afterwards that we heard of the fort of El Arish having been carried by surprise, and of the misfortune that beheld its garrison lulled into security by the parleys kept up with it, and by the hope of being sent back to France. The commandant was taken off his guard and yielded to the courteous request made to him to allow his fort to be visited, but the gate was no longer sooner opened than the Turkish soldiery rushed in and fell upon the garrison, who, relying on the vigilance of its officers, had been equally inattentive to the snare laid against their confiding candor. The fort was carried, and the unfortunate soldiers of the garrison were beheaded almost to a man in the presence of a wretched traitor of his country, who, bearing the uniform of England, became their agent in the execution of this sanguinary deed. For we afterwards learned that the very courier dispatched by Sir Sidney Smith to request a suspension of arms conveyed to 2 French emigrants placed by him with the Turkish army in order to accelerate any price the capture of El Arish, so that the accomplishment of the latter object might precede the grant of the suspension of arms, which accordingly followed this event. The entrance into Egypt, therefore, no longer interrupted in that quarter. The intelligence of the capture of the fort and of the agreement to an armistice reached General Kleber at one and the same moment. This gave reason for the first time to suspect the sincerity of which Sir Sidney Smith had made so much display, and of which Kleber appeared to have been the dupe. We could not help remarking that, had we sailed from Damietta, we might have arrived the same night in front of Gaza, where the Vizier was still encamped, and within as short a time as a small vessel which Sir Sidney Smith sent with his dispatches, and that by negotiating in person for the suspension of arms we might have saved El Arish from falling into the enemy's hands. Sir Sidney Smith, however, under the pretext that military men cannot cope with sailors on their element, carried us first to Cyprus, next to Tyre, and afterwards to St. Chanticleer, and lastly, at the expiration of 30 days, he conducted us to the house of the British consul at the port of Jaffa, and then quitted us to rejoin the Vizier, who had just removed his camp from Gaza to El Arish. Previously to his departure, he had ordered his ship to proceed to the coast of Caramania for supply of water, so that we were left wholly at the mercy of the Turks.